Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The recording that you just heard there, the famous recording of the speech delivered by American President Ronald Reagan on July 12th of 1987 during his visit to Berlin, where he is issuing a plea, issuing a request, some may say almost a veiled ultimatum for the removal of the Berlin Wall, the wall that had divided East and West Berlin and was symbolic of the division between East and West Germany that had stood following the division of Germany after World War I, and the wall itself first being constructed in August of 1961 to divide the city of Berlin. That speech given by Reagan in 1987 seems somewhat prophetic when you realize that slightly less than 2.5 years later, on November 1 of 1989, the Berlin Wall did come down. And the things that resulted from that produced a unified or a reunified Germany and a lot of changes in what had been the former Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, and became one of the most influential events of the late 20th century, marking the end of a period of time that we know as the Cold War. So today on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast, we're glad to have you joining us. We're going to be talking about the historical what-if that centers around the Berlin Wall, and particularly today we're going to explore what would have happened if the Berlin Wall had not fallen, or perhaps had taken a much longer period of time to fall. I'm Don Shelley, your host. We welcome you back. I'm joined today by my co-host and co-founder of the podcast. That's Alexis Shelley. Alexis, how are we doing this evening?
I'm good. I'm just cold because it's November in Texas.
And it's November in Texas, which, by the way, doesn't always mean that it's cold. And cold for us is the fact that we've had our first major cold front pass through southeast Texas in the last 24 hours, and we have dared to dive into temperatures in Fahrenheit readings that are in the lower 30s. For those of you that are listening internationally, we never got down below 0 Celsius. We didn't break down below 32 Fahrenheit, but for us, this is cold, especially when it's accompanied by wind. So there's cold winds of change that are blowing, and I guess that's part of what we can actually talk about here as we talk about the winds of change and the change that resulted from the fall of the Berlin Wall. So again, we're happy to have you join us for this episode where we're going to explore that. So as a starting point, Alexis, you were one of the ones who suggested that we actually do this topic, and so I'm actually going to ask you to sort of give our listeners a little bit of a background of what was the Berlin Wall and why did it make a difference that it fell?
Sure. So the Berlin Wall, as you alluded to a little bit, is the wall that actually divided East and West Berlin after the end of World War II. So starting in May of 1945, right after the end of World War II, Soviet troops actually occupied the city of Berlin and, started to militarized that country and started to take over the government of that country as part of the peace settlement after World War II and the division of the countries that were involved in that war. And it wasn't until 61 that the actual border was closed between East and West Berlin. So the country of Germany as itself was kind of divided into 4 different zones between the Allied powers, so the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the Soviet Union, and then Berlin itself was subdivided into 4 zones with those 4 countries taking control over each of their respective sectors. So it was a little bit of an interesting makeup that made up Germany in terms of that 4 sections within the country, but then 4 sections within the capital, Berlin itself, all following World War II, after the end of World War II. So that's kind of an overview of what the wall was. It was a dividing line between East and West Berlin, and kind of between the Western countries. The way it kind of fell is the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada were on the Allied side, the Western side, for as you'll kind of hear in modern nomenclature, and then the Eastern side being the Soviet Union, also controlling Berlin.
Right, and then of course the what we come to know as the West and the East there, the Cold War, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. And I guess one of the things that's interesting to note for folks who may not be familiar with the geography is that Berlin as a city was wholly contained within what became East Germany. East Germany being the quarter of the nation that had been placed under Soviet control in the division after World War II. And so the wall you might think of as being keeping East Germans in, or East Berliners inside of their part. Actually, what it was doing was totally surrounding and cutting off West Berlin from the rest of East Germany, which Berlin was contained inside of. And so when we think of the wall here, think of it as being a total enclosure that completely surrounded Western Berlin. In fact, one of the things that eventually happens is there's an airlift that becomes necessary to bring in supplies until they're able to make other arrangements for how foodstuffs and other things are even going to get to West Berlin when the wall was initially constructed.
Correct, yeah. Definitely the Allied powers were like, nope, the Soviet Union is not going to have complete control of the capital of Germany, hence why they had to subdivide Berlin, because as you mentioned, Berlin did fall squarely within that section of Germany that was in control by the Soviet Union.
And I guess, again, placing me in the context of history here, I was born in the late 60s, so my early childhood and my earliest memories are of East versus West, the NATO versus Warsaw Pact, United States versus Soviet Union. And I guess in my head, it wasn't until much later that I came to really realize that Berlin was inside of East Germany. I always thought, well, it was right there on the border. It just happens to be the way things were quartered up and divided. No, the wall itself surrounded West Berlin, which of course is what made it interesting as well. It also created one of the crises that happened during the Cold War, the period of time roughly from 1945, 1946 up until, and we'll talk about this, the fall of the Berlin Wall marks the beginning of the end of what we know as the Cold War, sort of officially being declared over in many ways in 1990. So again, our alternate history path today is going to be look at what would have happened if the Berlin Wall hadn't have fallen. Now, it should be obvious, but probably worth setting here. We're not talking about the importance of the wall itself, although the wall falling was a unique event, and we'll post some links to videos and some of the other things that are around that particular event. If you don't know it well, I remember it very well. I was in college at the time. But when we talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall, we're talking about the fall of communism of the Soviet bloc in Europe. And so the wall itself becomes, as you mentioned before, Alexis, becomes symbolic.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I'm kind of the same as you. I kind of always had in my head that Berlin was in the exact center of Germany, and it just kind of fell that Berlin got divided up with the separate sections that Germany was divided up in. That was not the case. And also, kind of, you were talking about the timeline as well. It's interesting to think about because the World War II happened in the 40s, and the wall didn't fall until 1990, and actually late 1990. So when I'm thinking about it, I was actually born February 1991, so Mom was actually pregnant when the wall fell.
Actually,
so
that's not exactly
weird
true.
To me.
Yeah, because it's late 1989, so it's a little bit before that. But
True.
But it's in that same
things
time
are still
frame.
happening in 1990, which is weird to think things are happening 90 so close to my actual birth and my actual timeline, because we're talking about something that started essentially at the end of World War II. It's interesting that it essentially spans for 50 years.
Right. Well, and the other thing about that is that it is a long period of time. The other thing about that is that puts in line the fact how long it's been since the fall. In fact, as the podcast episode here will be released in November of 2019. Which means we're a little more than 30 years removed from the fall of the wall, and so that's not a short period of time.
No.
The wall. In fact, it's about roughly, give or take, somewhere in the neighborhood of about how long the wall stood. So we're about as far removed now from when it fell as it was from when the wall was first constructed until then. And again, the alternate history path that we're going to take here is imagining what would have happened if the wall had not fell. And that's symbolic then of understanding what would have been different about geopolitics, European geopolitics, and really when you start talking about the wall not falling, what you're really talking about more than anything else, and we talked about this a little bit off podcast, Alexis, is you're really talking about how might this, not how Germany, East and West Germany might have been different, but you're talking about how things might have been different with the Soviet Union if there had not been a fall of the wall. So we'll find ourselves moving over into that just by extension.
Right, exactly.
And so, one of the things to understand is that we heard the proclamation there, the request made by President Reagan is to Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall. Of course, he's referring to Mikhail Gorbachev. Alexis, who was Mikhail Gorbachev?
The president of the USSR.
Yeah, the president, premier, first secretary, those titles were sometimes used interchangeably. He is the leader of the Soviet Union.
Yes, the head honcho.
Yeah, the head honcho. To use the technical political term from the late 80s, he's the head honcho of the Soviet Union. But he is the leader of the Soviet Union, and thus by extension the leader of the Soviet bloc. The Soviet bloc there being the nations of Eastern Europe that were under Soviet domination and Soviet control. They were theoretically independent nations, but they were not fully independent, and they owed their allegiance to, their governments were supported by, and they were oppressed by the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev is not in Berlin. He's not an East German. He's not from East Berlin. Mikhail Gorbachev is the leader of the Soviet Union. So when the American president says tear down this wall, he's not saying that to a German leader. He's saying that to a Soviet leader. And so that's an important thing to pick up is the understanding is that it's not necessarily the case that the average citizen in East Germany wanted to be living on the other side of that wall. It's just that they didn't have a choice because they were under the influence of the East German government and, of course, were under the influence of the Soviet Union.
Correct, absolutely.
Yeah, so if you look back on that and thinking that through, it's important to understand that it wasn't just East Germany that's under Soviet influence, although we'll spend a lot of time talking about today, but it was the rest of the Soviet bloc. So roughly, Alexis, what was the difference between West Germany and East Germany before the wall fell?
So West Germany was westernized in the way we normally think of it. So it had democracy, it had advancements, it had freedom of thought, freedom of thinking. Whereas East Germany, again, because it's under that repressive regime of the Soviet Union, it was very authoritarian. You had restrictions on what you could do for a living, where you could go, what you could have in your house. It was very closely monitored, whereas you had on the West German side, you had a little more free movement, a little more freedom of thought, and a little more freedom with what you could do with your life. In East Germany, it was more along the lines of the government kind of told you how things were going to go. You didn't really have a say in how your life was going to turn out. Right.
And the other interesting thing there, again, for many of our listeners who are old enough to remember what the Cold War was, remember what these distinctions were, I know for me, I catch myself, I spent so much of my early life, particularly being a major in political science, properly calling what we now call Russia the Soviet Union. Now it's sometimes hard for me to call that Russia because I spent so long calling it by the correct name, the Soviet Union. But the actual technical names for the two different German republics were the Federal Republic of Germany, that was West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, or the GDR, which was East Germany. And while they were certainly under the influence of the Soviet Union, they were part of the Warsaw Pact, which was the military alliance for the Soviet bloc or for Eastern Europe. They were in and of themselves probably one of the more advanced Soviet client states. Those who were in power in East Germany weren't just in power because they were solely beholden to the Soviet Union, but they liked being in power in the East Germany that they had created. I guess that's an important thing to say, is that they were zealots in some way. Many of the leaders there were very zealous of their position as being socialist, communist, whichever term they would have preferred to have used, and having that part of Germany, the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, be an adherent to that. So much so that they were also part of what helped to oppress and also what were used by the Soviets to keep the other Eastern Bloc countries in line.
Right.
Yeah. So in the real timeline of history, Lex, sort of continuing forward, the wall falls. What happens after that?
So the wall falls in 1989, as we mentioned, and quickly after that, you see the reunification of Germany as a state, and them kind of trying to find their footing again in terms of Europe, but also in terms of the world. So that happens in 1990. So we have the wall falling in November of 1989, and then by October of 1990, you have Germany reunited as a country, and again trying to find its place on the European stage and on the world stage following the reunification.
Right. And so they are now a unified nation politically, but they are not the same type of nation, or not in the same condition after the unification or because of the division, as one might expect. What's the nature of the state of things in what had been East Germany as it becomes part of the unified Germany?
It becomes very quickly apparent that East Germany is very far behind in terms of technological advances and just advances in general, and they're kind of having to play catch up. So Germany, the new unified Germany, what had been West Germany, is kind of having to invest a lot of money and invest a lot of time into bringing what had been East Germany up to the standard that West Germany was at. They're having to kind of galvanize themselves as a full country again, because it became very quickly apparent that even though now we're one Germany, East Germany and West Germany were not on equal footing in terms of economic systems, political systems, just basic systems, basic living conditions. So what had been West Germany is having to kind of bring East Germany up to meet it following that unification, and is investing a lot of money and a lot of time in that process.
Yeah, and it's easy for me. I sort of, as I was doing the research here, I guess I knew this, but it's one of the things that I hadn't really thought about. Is that I assume, well, that's 30 years ago. That's done. That's over with. And the answer is really still no. There still is a disparity in terms of the citizens that were the former West German citizens and the East Germans in terms of earnings, obviously in terms of wealth. You can't just rebuild infrastructure easily without it crippling your economy if it's been neglected for a period of time. And so it's easy to think, well, they're past that now. They're past the economic impacts of the reunification. And the answer to that really is no. In fact, there's still about a 1/3 difference in wages between the average, if you will, West German and East German, even though they're one country now, in terms of where the citizens reside, in terms of which part they were in. And so it's still a process that Germany is dealing with today, is still overcoming the economic hurdles of reunification.
Right, and as you mentioned, and kind of to that point, we're only 30 years out from the fall of the wall, and the wall was up for 40 years, essentially. So it's been down for about the same time it was up. So that's a continuing process, and it's going to take a long time to kind of repair those wounds and kind of get things back to where they were.
Right. I'm just going to quote a couple statistics here because they really jumped out at me. This is actually from an article that was written. Actually, it's about 5 years old. It was actually written on the 25th anniversary of the reunification. But one of the things that it was talking about, for example, was that the productivity, factory productivity, or just the general productivity of the economy from what had been the East compared to that in the West was in 1991, so right after the reunification, the productivity of the economy of what had been East Germany was about 70% of that of what had been West Germany. By 2012, it had risen by a full 3% to 73%. And so part of that was just the aging infrastructure, older factories that weren't designed necessarily to be run as efficiently as those that were designed in the western part of Germany. such so that even after, in this case, there's 25 years roughly that's gone by, there's only been about a 3 to 4% increase in productivity. Poverty is still much more common on the eastern side of the part that was East Germany than West Germany. So again, one of the results of the fall of the wall and the reunification of Germany is it's had a tremendous impact on what the reunified Germany is over the last 30 years. And I bring that up because it'll be an important point of contrast if we go back and think about what would have happened if the wall had not fallen.
Right.
So we're going to look at two scenarios as we go back and think about the wall not falling. One of those is going to be that it still has not happened, so that we're sitting in 2019 still with some form of divide. It may not look exactly like the wall that fell in 1989 looks, but that we still have some form of divide between East and West Germany, and what that means also in terms of the divide potentially just again between the East and the West in general here, the East being Eastern Europe, not the East in the terms of Asia East as we often think of today, although that will come into the discussion here, I think, as we start talking about that. Then the other scenario might be a brief exploration of not necessarily the wall never falling, but the wall falling or the barrier being broken down being somewhat delayed. But the first one that we're going to go down is the possibility that the wall may still exist today. So there is no fall of the Berlin Wall. So as we mentioned, Alexis, the wall itself is not the factor here. If there still is a Berlin Wall today, what does that probably mean in terms of what else would be different in this alternate timeline?
If there's still a wall today, I think we would still be in a Cold War with Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union is the dominating power of East Germany. So if you have them still being, now granted, Russia is still a big player on the world stage, but if you have the Soviet Union still being in control of East Germany in the way it was, there is a not unreal possibility that the United States, the United Kingdom are still in this Cold War between the USSR, and it's possible that it might have turned into not a Cold War. It might have turned into a hot war if the Berlin Wall is still standing, because you have the USSR still being this powerhouse on the world stage and still retaining all of this influence and all of this dominance.
Right. I think the easy way for me to try to grasp that, what I would try to express as we talk about that as an alternative timeline of history, is that if you still have a wall, that's probably because it means you still have a Soviet Union.
Right, exactly.
That you don't have, it's very unlikely that you have the continuation of a standing Berlin Wall and everything that it represents. We've already talked about more than enough, probably more than we need to, about what it represents in terms of what's going on in the division of East and West Europe, Eastern Europe and Western Europe. If you still have a wall, that probably means you still have a Soviet bloc, you still have a Soviet Union, you still have all the other things in place. So one of the major differences if the wall hasn't fallen is not just whether the wall's standing, but it's what's going on still with geopolitics. For example, as you said, the Cold War is still going on. Now, one of the things that we had in the real timeline after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet bloc, in fact, it's in 1990 that you actually see almost an admission by the Soviet Union then still transitioning into breaking itself up into multiple parts and becoming Russia and the other former Soviet states, Ukraine and some of the others, sort of gaining independence and becoming separate entities. When the Cold War is declared over, is you have what some people might refer to as the peace dividend. Suddenly you had a lot of the money that the United States and other members of the NATO alliance were having to spend to prepare to defend themselves or defend Western Europe. Suddenly those are freed as they're able to reduce the size of their military, and suddenly they have dollars in their budgets that they didn't have before. You have this peace dividend.
Right. We would definitely, I don't think, have that peace dividend if we still had the Berlin Wall standing, because as you mentioned, the Berlin Wall still standing means we still have a USSR. And so we would still be probably having to maintain those funds to protect the U.S. and Western Europe from the USSR.
Right. And so under that scenario, again, with the wall standing, there's been no fall of the wall. The Cold War continues, or you've already mentioned that. And so it would have continued into the technology space that we have today. And so we would have seen a new generation of weapons come along. It's sort of hard to know exactly how some of the events that we think of as being major events politically and militarily, globally, For example, I think of one of the events that happened shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1889 is the invasion by Iraq of Kuwait.
Kuwait. Right.
And so because of that, we eventually end up with the first of two Gulf Wars where the United States is engaged in conflict there. There's some connection of that back to the period of time, the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it's hard to imagine it being as easy for the United States, or in some ways it might have actually been easier, to go off and fight that war or deal with the liberation of Kuwait if they had still been having to keep a wary eye on maintaining forces to defend Western Europe.
Right. They're not able to divert forces to other areas of the world because they're having to kind of keep these forces in reserve just in case we need them to battle the USSR.
Right. And so that would have been an entirely different tension that would have existed. And so, one possible outcome of the Berlin Wall still standing is you may have seen aggression such as was seen there in Iraq or in other parts of the world that would have been tougher for the United States to stand against, or the risk would have been that then the Soviets would have been backing Iraq against the United States. And so this would have been much more like the scenarios that we saw in other parts of the period of the Cold War, the situation in Korea, the situation in Vietnam, where you have these proxy wars that exist between in territory when it's between the various parts of the Western-controlled or Western-backed areas and then Soviet-backed areas.
Right, right.
Okay. So what are some of the other potential differences?
Well, another thing that you kind of alluded to that I wanted to touch on is if the wall's still standing, we still have, you mentioned technology, not only technology in terms of warfare and in terms of weapons and things like that, we have technology just in terms of connecting the world. So things like the internet, phones, things that still would exist even though we would have this wall still standing. So I think it's an interesting thing to think about how information would be getting into East Berlin with the wall standing while having this benefit of the outside world, for lack of a better word, having this advancement in technology in terms of the internet and in terms of this connectivity that the technology has brought to the rest of the world. How would that kind of information be snuck into East Berlin, and how would they handle that information? Would they come more into themselves, or would they combat against it? How would they, combat things like the internet, like iPhones, like Skype, which is how we're recording this podcast right now? How would they kind of protect themselves from that spread of information is an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, and so while we think of the wall as being primarily a physical wall, and there were things like Radio Free Europe and the transmissions of radio transmissions into East Germany to Soviet-backed members of the Warsaw Pact, places like Poland and Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia and a lot of these other places. In fact, that's one thing we'll talk about here. Nations that sort of no longer exist in some ways because of what's happened there as well. But the wall would not have remained just a physical divide. It would have had to become more of a digital divide or a way of keeping information out. And one of the parallels that we talked about, I know, Alexis, was this idea of there's another place in the world that's sort of divided by a line that was one country before and is now two separate countries, and we see that still playing itself out in 2019. And what is that?
That would be North Korea.
Right. That would be Korea, South Korea versus North Korea. And I think it's a fair parallel to sort of draw, some of the parallels that exist between West Germany and East Germany are similar to some of the parallels that exist between South Korea and North Korea.
Right. Yeah. No, that is not, I think, an outlandish comparison at all. So I think if the wall was still standing today, much like you see with North Korea and South Korea, there would be this twisting of the news. There would be this monopolizing of the news to try and suppress it down and to try and keep the message what they want it to be, and keep people away from seeing what everybody else is seeing in the world with that technology that is making the world a more connected place. I think there'd be a more concentrated effort if the wall still existed, with that digital divide of, no, you can't look at that. Look at this. Look at the party line, so to speak.
Right. And so again, you would still have a divided Germany. You would still have a divided East and West Europe, but you would have it divided in different ways, perhaps than it is now. The physical divide of a wall and fences and borders, but you would also have the digital divide that exists between the two. So again, physical divide plus digital divide means for a divided Germany and a divided rest of Europe, and again continuing to be the NATO versus Warsaw Pacts and East and Western Europe. The other thing that's interesting to me, though, is the concept of, again, in order to have a survival of the Berlin Wall, you have to have a different version of the Soviet Union. I actually think that's one of the more intriguing things to me, is that part of what leads to the ability for the wall to come down is the openness and some of the reforms that Mikhail Gorbachev was bringing to the Soviet Union. So if we're imagining the wall doesn't fall, we probably have to imagine a scenario where either he has to take a step back or he is forced to take a step back from that. And so again, we end up with not just a different Germany and a different divided Europe, but we end up with a different Soviet Union. And one of the things that crossed my mind, I think we talked about this a little bit off podcast, Alexis, was this idea of imagine that there's a different form of the Soviet Union that may look a little bit more like something we are more familiar with today. What if the Soviet Union that we have today looked a little bit more like the China that we're dealing with today?
Right. I think that's an interesting concept to think about. And I think we kind of coined this term off podcast. It was like Western style communism, which is kind of where China is. They're a communist country, but they have some very Western ideals and Western thoughts about certain things, which kind of allows them,
particularly economic. They are
exactly.
willing to compete on the economic front as not being adherents to socialism and communism. They've created a very modern economy inside of still a socialistic state.
Right, they're totally up for the fair market idea. So yeah, specifically with economics, in terms of economics. So I think if we have this is, I think, kind of going along that vein now of maybe delayed fall of the wall in terms of a not falling at all. If we have a delayed falling of the wall, it might be because Gorbachev has been able to continue with those policies, and so the USSR kind of becomes this, again, more country more like we think of modern day China, in terms of it's still communist, but kind of having those democratic ideals, specifically in terms of economy. And so you have this idea of maybe Gorbachev, or the leader after Gorbachev, is thinking like, maybe the wall's not such a good idea anymore. We don't really need that anymore, because they're able to kind of open their minds, so to speak, to a more Western way of thinking and Western way of doing things.
Right. And I think where that's intriguing to me is the idea that, again, now we have a Russia that in some ways is reminiscent of Cold War Soviet Union, but is also very different. And again, the contrast, I think it's the different cultures. Even using the term democratic to describe almost anything that's going on inside of China is really a misnomer, except that we're talking about more of a capitalistic approach to an economic output still inside of a controlled state. If you have a Soviet Union that doesn't open up as much to cause sort of the complete collapse of the Soviet system, but you have a Soviet Union that opens up enough to allow for and maybe undertake some economic reform while keeping things politically very controlled and inside of a context there, that's a very different scenario. And so what may have happened in Europe, certainly may have happened in the Soviet Union than in Europe in the 30 years where the wall still stands, is you may again see many of the things that are much more like what's happening now with the struggles between how do you deal with a situation like Hong Kong, where you have something that is still under a tight political control, but is economically very viable. And so it's curious to me to think about not the Russia of Putin today, which also definitely is an authoritarian regime, but a Russia that's still under a Politburo, a Soviet regime, but it doesn't have the level of corruption that Russia has today. It doesn't have the level of being a cult of personality of one man. It still more is what we were accustomed to during the Soviet Union, where it's the party and the state. It's not a personality, but it's a system that's continuing to sustain itself.
Right, it's the national identity as opposed to the ideology of a person as the head.
Right. And so it's similar, but at the same time different. Does that make any sense?
No, yeah, it does.
And,
It's an interesting thing to think about. I'm looking at the list right now of actually the countries that actually made up the USSR, and it's as we've mentioned before, it's countries like Lithuania, Russia, of course, Ukraine, Latvia, Georgia. So I mean, there's several different countries that made up the USSR that are countries as we know them today. But if we're dealing with something that's still the USSR, we wouldn't have those individual nationalities to be working with.
right. And again, they were part of a system that was imposed. The Soviet Union imposed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and so while those were all sort of technically separate states or entities to some degree, they were obviously under one large control, Russia dominating them inside of the Soviet Union. But we wouldn't have, there are unique identities to each one of those elements now. Ukraine is different than Russia, whereas it would have been a more unified thing. And the economy would have been much stronger with some of the unification there as well. I guess the other big change that I think about is actually the map of Eastern Europe, in the sense that if you were to go through the list of nations that were part of the Warsaw Pact, the Warsaw Pact being the military alliance that was led by the Soviet Union, among the states that were loyal to it during the Cold War. You look at the list of, by the way, the Warsaw Pact is also dissolved in July of 1991. It doesn't survive as a result of the wall falling and things that are happening there. But if you look back to the list of nations that were part of the Warsaw Pact, many of those nations don't exist today. The nations of the former Soviet bloc. For example, there is no Czechoslovakia today.
Right.
What is there?
There's Czech Republic today.
And there's Slovakia, and then what we know of as being Yugoslavia was a nation that also no longer exists today. It's been broken up into multiple parts as well. And so one of the things that happened as a result of the fall of the Berlin Wall was that freedom spread throughout all of Eastern Europe, what had been the former Soviet bloc. It spread in different ways, but for example, what happens the very next month is, while ultimately it maybe certainly leads toward a more free Romania, but you have the fall of Ceausescu in Romania in December of 1989, and that was not a peaceful transition of power by any stretch of the imagination.
No, and that was just one example. Romania is one example. There were several former Soviet Union countries that once they got under from the yoke of the Soviet Union and kind of were trying to find their footing, they did not go peacefully from the Soviet Union as they were kind of trying to find their footing there. And Romania is just one example of that.
Yeah. For example, for me, one of the things that I remember very distinctly is 1984. The Winter Olympics take place in Sarajevo in Yugoslavia. While it is still part of the Soviet bloc, while it is still a communist nation, later when Yugoslavia dissolves and it breaks off into its various components, there ends up being essentially a civil war or conflict there in Sarajevo. Is not this crowning jewel that was put forth during the 1984 Winter Olympic Games, but it's a place that, for those people that are familiar with and think back to this reference in the 1980s in Lebanon, it's more like a Beirut. It's a place where there's conflict going on and where things are not easily resolved because of that.
Right.
And so, one of the things that would happen as a result of there not being a fall is that while there would still be people that were oppressed and were not politically free, there would also not be some of the things that happened as a result of the birth pangs of freedom, if you will, where there's conflict and the breakup of sort of these artificial nations that got created, like a Yugoslavia, that were part of the Soviet bloc. And you would have had, yes, you would have still had people oppressed, but you wouldn't have had the conflict that has existed.
Right, exactly. I think birth pangs is a good description of that. That's, again, trying to find their footing after they're getting out of the USSR. If we still have the USSR, we don't have those conflicts and those things arising.
Right. And so one of the other things that was also interesting was again, we to sort of circle back and sort of come full circle, is the impact on the German economy. West Germany's economy, the Federal Republic of Germany's economy before the fall of the Berlin Wall, was actually one of the more sustainable economies in Europe. And what did they have the advantage of, Alexis? We were talking about this off podcast.
Oh, remind me.
Yeah, they had the advantage of cheap East German labor.
Oh, right, exactly. Things were much cheaper to get over in East Germany.
Right, and so, for example, one of the things that was used there was the example of, this is back during the days of film. Let me explain for our younger audience what film is, because we're so accustomed to digital photography. But you actually used to take pictures, and you didn't immediately know what they looked like. You actually had to go and have them developed, and so you took them someplace. And of course, what eventually came to be in the 70s and the 80s was faster, instant, 24-hour development of these pictures. But the way that was actually done in Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall is that the West German photographer would drop off his film to be developed at the West German photo developing place, and where would it actually be sent to be developed?
It would be taken in a car over to East Germany.
Right. It would get developed, and then it would come back. And so they had the advantage of this. We mentioned before, later they would have to pay the price for trying to upgrade the facilities and the economic disadvantage that East Germany represented once there was the unification. But prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, they had the advantage of having that without the cost of doing it, if that makes any sense.
Right. They had the labor, it was cheap labor, but they had the benefit of having better better technological advances and better equipment, for lack of a better word, that they had the benefit of.
Right. So again, the German economy becomes larger, and you might argue becomes stronger eventually as a result of the fall of the Berlin Wall. But it would have been potentially much more advantageous to the West German economy to have not had the additional burden that was required in terms of taxation and spending by the government to basically bring East Germany, or even today, they're still in the process of trying to bring East Germany up to the standards that it needs to be equivalent with what had been West Germany. But you also didn't have the economic advantages that existed of having a cheap local place to go and get cheap labor and to get things produced in a relatively cheap way.
Right. Once you have the unification, you have people from former East Germany that are like, hey, they're being paid this, I want to be paid that too. So you don't have that cheap labor happening anymore.
Right. And so one of the again, some of the consequences, again, freedom is brought by the falling of the wall. We argue that that's a good thing. But so often we look at alternative timelines here on A Fork in Time, we find that there are not necessarily good consequences that may result of an overall good thing that's happening. One of the examples that I think about particularly is the example when I did the episode series on the Black Death in Europe. Was it a good thing that maybe as much as 60% of the population of Europe was wiped out? No. We're talking about millions and millions of people dying. However, it changed the economic structure, as we talked about at length on those series of episodes. It changed the economic structure in such a way because of a sudden change in the population configuration and labor being able to rise, getting out of the feudal system, all the things that came with that. So one of the unintended consequences of a bad event was actually something that in the long enough run actually becomes potentially a net positive because of the things that flowed from that. And now you're in the example of the fall of the Berlin Wall, you have something that's sort of the opposite, where obviously the immediate thing you think of is, oh, it's great, people are free, all of these things are going to happen. But then what's ultimately going to happen as a result of that freedom is there's going to be civil war and conflict in some countries that had been glossed over for a number of years because those in power had kept that from happening. And then you have the other things that flow just again from people becoming free and the things that happen as a result of that. So is the fall of the Berlin Wall a net good? I think it's hard to argue that it's not, but does it have potentially bad consequences, at least in the short term, that are sometimes tough to handle and can also cause the loss of life and cause other things as well?
Right, exactly. I think that gets to why I love doing this podcast, though. History and even counterfactuals as well, it's not black and white. There's always this gray area. Yes, the fall of the Berlin Wall, overall, a very positive thing. But that doesn't mean everything that happens as a result of that event is positive. There are bad things that are going to occur. And that's pretty much with anything that happens in history.
Right.
Even though it's overall net positive, that doesn't mean there's not going to be at least one negative consequence.
Yeah. Well, and finally, I think that's an interesting thing to note, and perhaps is a nice place to sort of put a bow here on the episode. But the last thing that I wanted to mention is that that's one of the tricky parts about doing, we sometimes mention the more technical term, the counterfactual, the alternate history, is that it's easy to assume, and as you've just stated, and I've stated before there as well, that everything that is going to be different is going to be good. The one thing you can definitely say is that everything that's going to be different is going to be different. And those differences are going to bring both good things and they're going to bring bad things. And sometimes the overall measure of if you will, overall net good, overall net bad is solely a function of how long do you want to measure that over.
Right. I mean, as we've also talked about with this podcast, we're only 30 years out. We're still feeling the effects of this event that happened in 1989. So there's possibly effects that we don't even know what they are yet because
Right.
they're so long term. So it's how far do you want to carry that out in terms of are you weighing it positive or negatively?
Right. And so, yeah, it's even doing this 30 years after the event and thinking about what the alternative might be, maybe, I guess the simple way to say this, it's not to belabor the point, but it may be too soon to know, is it generally speaking, is it a net positive or is it a net negative? It's been both so far, and it may take 50 years, 100 years, 200 years to sort of reach the point of saying, oh, it was a massive net positive because look, it brought freedom and it changed this and it changed that. But it's not necessarily an easy call to make right now to know, are we at that point? And again, we don't even know what might happen after this that we look back and say, oh, that's also the result of that. So now we have to reevaluate this.
Right.
In fact, one of the things we've talked about off podcast is the challenge of doing things that are quote unquote more modern. In other words, how far back can you go to have a real fork in time that you know the answer to? If you go back to 1492, you go back to 1066, just throwing out dates that history lovers will know, 1776. You make changes there, you've had enough time that you sort of feel like you have a pretty good sense on what difference it made. When you go back to 1989, maybe not so much. We still don't know what the output's really going to be or the end result's going to be of Russia as it exists now. Well, Russia as it exists now is a result of the change to the Soviet Union, which again is not directly tied to the fall of the Berlin Wall, except that it is generally tied to what led to that, which were the reforms and the changes that were made under Gorbachev that eventually led to the point that this could happen.
Right. It's all domino and it's all connected.
Right. And so I think that's just an interesting thing to say here. And again, why some of these people may ask, why don't we do more modern, if you will, or things that are closer in time? Part of the reason is it's tougher to actually evaluate what the change is when you look at that very short period of time. So
extremely difficult.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add, Lex?
Not really. I'm also reminded of our September 11th episode as well, in that talking about something that happened not that long ago, so we're still feeling the effects of it. And I'm reminded of the stat we brought up that, more people have died, or we've reached basically we're even now, people that died on that day and people that have died afterwards. It's kind of that same concept of we're still feeling the effects of things like that. So again, that's why we don't really do a lot of modern stuff. That's why when you text me and you're like, anything modern you have in mind? And I'm like, I really don't want to go any more modern than 1989. So, because
Right.
it's just hard. It's hard to see what those ripple effects are.
Okay, I agree. Well, we hope you've enjoyed our episode today. Been a little bit different to cover this. I I feel somewhat in some ways we were a little disjointed on the topic, again, because the very things that we're talking about here, it's hard to figure things through. And also it's hard to imagine. To me, that what's interesting about this is a fork in time when you talk about the fall of the wall happening or not happening, is that the actual event itself, the way that we refer to the event, the fall of the wall, is not really the event. It's just a symbolic thing that represents that there was a change going on. And so when you start looking down the alternate timeline of history, you're not talking about whether the wall fell or not. What you're saying is, could there have been a different set of circumstances that would not have led to that in the near term, and what would that have looked like moving forward? So it's one of these sort of, it's a fork in time, and you pick that as the fork, saying that's what's symbolic. That's how we would know that it didn't happen. The other stuff didn't happen, but it's just the surface thing for all these other things that go behind the scenes, if that makes any sense.
Right.
And so, if you were to have the magic, we sometimes talk about the magic Wayback Machine or the magic time machine. By the way, we should probably give credit to the guys from Stuff You Should Know every time we do that, because they use that as their reference point. I know that's where I picked it up mentally, and what I think about is that if you had the time machine to go forward from that time and you still saw the wall, so you were in Berlin, all you could do was jump forward to 2019, you look and you go, oh, there's still a wall here, and then jump back to 1989 before the fall of the wall. What that would signal to you is that things are still the way that they were between the Eastern and Western European powers. That's how you would know. The wall would be symbolic of that. So the fall of the wall is symbolic of the fact that something changed.
Right.
So,
it's just the flashpoint.
Right, and an outward manifestation. So, again, we thank you for joining us here today on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast, as we've explored the historical what if of what if the Berlin Wall had not fallen and everything that goes around that. Sort of as we're closing out, just want to remind you again, there's a number of ways that you can interact with us. If you heard our last episode, which was episode 26, which was sort of our retrospective after completing 25 episodes, Alexis, we talked about a number of the things there. Do you want to mention some of the ways that folks can interact with us and can share ideas with us and how we can have more of a conversation instead of us just transmitting to them?
Absolutely. So our basic place that you can get a hold of us in a lot of different ways is our website, which is a forkintimepodcast.com. The A is important on the front. The podcast is important on the back. Otherwise, you won't get to our website. But from that website, you can get links to all the various podcatchers where you can find episodes of A Fork in Time. We strongly suggest that you subscribe to episodes in your various podcatcher. Then you don't have to do any work. They just appear in your podcast feed. But you can also connect to our social medias from there. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and we're also on Pinterest. You can also email us, aforkintimepodcast@gmail.com. We love hearing from people and hearing their suggestions for topics, and if they thought we got something right or got something massively wrong, we want to hear that too. We want to have a conversation with you. Also from that website, you can do a listener survey. It's a really short, quick listener survey, only about 10 questions, and you can, again, provide us with some feedback in terms of suggestions for topics that you think you might be interested in, how long you think an episode should be, just different things like that kind of help us tailor our episodes and kind of make them what our listeners really want to hear. Of course, we're only 27 episodes in. We're still kind of finding our way, and we hope that you've enjoyed the journey so far, but we hope that you continue to journey with us back into time, and doing something like that listener survey or connecting with us on social media or sending us an email really helps us kind of connect with you and kind of find out what you want to know and what you kind of want to hear about.
Yeah, I agree. All of those things are good ways to get a hold of us. I don't think you mentioned the Patreon page, did you, Lex?
I did not. So we also have a Patreon page, and again, you can find a link to that Patreon page from our website. Of course, we're not in this business to make money. We're just in this business because we'd be talking about history even if we weren't doing a podcast. That's the nature of my dad and mine's conversations. But if you are so inclined and you are able to support the podcast, we would love to have you as a patron. And there's some fun perks. Of course, patrons always get first dibs on episode topics. You can even also will possibly reach out to you if you'd like to be a co-host on an episode if you suggest a topic, because we always want to get people who are interested in those specific topics. They want to come talk to us about them. That'd be great too. So if you are so inclined, we would love to have you join us as a Patreon.
Again, we thank you, as we always do. We probably do that too many times, but we feel like we need to. And we
We're
ask
Southern. We like to thank people.
we like to thank people, although it doesn't feel very Southern, as we talked about at the start of the episode, because it's cold outside, and we're not accustomed to that. So we invite you to join us again next time on the next episode, where we'll have another topic where we go back and explore a fork in time. And we would encourage you that should you happen upon a fork in the road or a fork in time between now and the next time, what should you do, Lex?
Take it.
Take it. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Join us next time.